Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I agree with what you said at the beginning that engaging with a Catholic Orthodox conversation has the potential to be very productive because we already have so much in common. I just want to kind of go back through the central questions which govern the premises of this discussion. I think the first one we have to ask is the nature of the connection between Peter and Rome. Because if one is talking about the scriptures and if one is going to the New Testament, one can say a lot about Peter, but the question of Peter's relationship to Rome is something which has to be settled outside the New Testament because it's something which becomes relevant in the post-apostolic age. And we do have patristic and ancient witnesses to a connection between Peter and Rome. The difficulty is that the connection between Peter and Rome found in the great majority of these post-apostolic witnesses is not the connection which Vatican I makes. In the popes of Rome themselves, those who we would most expect to have an ecclesiology like Vatican I, we read things like the See of Peter is the See of one in 3 places, or assigning special sacred prerogatives to the Church of Alexandria and the Church of Antioch in virtue of their foundation from Peter, or the assigning the special ministry of the Apostle Paul as having some significance to the nature of Roman primacy. I think all of these raise very significant questions about the degree to which we can make an inference from what we can know about Peter to what we can know about Rome. I would say another thing here is, what does important mean? We can say the Church of Rome was important, and I absolutely agree with that, and you'd have to be a fool to read through first millennium ecclesiastical literature and deny that Rome was important. The Council of Chalcedon even speaks of the Bishop of Rome as the Archbishop of all the churches. But the question is, what does that mean? What is an archbishop? If you look at something like Apostolic Canon 34, it specifically delineates the nature of the archiepiscopal office. And it is an office which requires consensus building. It is one where the archbishop coordinates and mediates among the churches under him, but does not have the right to unilaterally intervene in the church under him. The question about the nature of the prime ministry, I think there are several things that we can say here. First of all, even in the Roman Catholic view that's generally set forth today, there's not a one-to-one equivalence between the prime minister of the Old Testament and the Bishop of Rome in the New Covenant. And the reason for that is because the Bishop of Rome is generally not conceived today as a civil magistrate, whereas that is exactly what the prime minister is. The temporal power of the Church of Rome is something which you can find virtually no precedent for whatsoever until very late in the first millennium. And it's something which most Roman Catholic scholars today would not defend. And if there's no temporal power which is intrinsic to the office of the Bishop of Rome, then there's not a one-to-one equivalence. Does the Eastern Orthodox position say that the prime minister kind of drops out of existence? Well, I would say a couple things. I would say, first of all, the structure of the kingdom in the New Covenant is more complex than the structure of the kingdom in the Old Covenant because it's much larger. It is a single kingdom which encompasses a global scale. And as such, it is going to have more levels of hierarchy. It's going to be more complicated, and we have no reason to assume from the outset that there is going to be a one-to-one equivalence between this set of offices in the Old Testament and that set of offices in the New Testament. That said, Orthodoxy does not deny the existence of universal primacy. It does not deny that the Bishop of Rome, in some sense, could be head of all the churches of God. That's a patristic phrase. I would simply say that the way in which the Bishop of Rome can be conceived of as head of all the churches of God is exactly the way in which the Archbishop of Athens might be conceived of as head of all the churches of Greece, or the ecumenical patriarch might be conceived of as head of all the churches under his jurisdiction. In all of these cases, there is no canonical right to a unilateral right of intervention without recourse of appeal, whereas in the Catholic doctrine, the Roman Catholic doctrine of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, it is an intrinsic aspect of that teaching that there is no appeal past the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome, and he can intervene unilaterally. He doesn't need to be appealed to, which the canons of Sardica specifically say has to be done in order for his jurisdiction to be canonical in the first place. So that is the central question, I think. I think in some way the Roman Catholic has a more difficult burden when we have this argument, because the Roman Catholic has a very robust dogmatic view of what the papacy is that has to be defended. And it belongs to the nature of that doctrine that there is an assertion of strong continuity with the church from the first millennium. So certain Roman Catholic scholars and apologists have appealed to a concept of development to explain why we don't see maybe the sorts of things that we see later in church history, earlier in church history. But I would just say, look at something like Satis Cognitum, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Satis Cognitum. What kind of jurisdiction does he believe the bishops of Rome exercised from the time of Clement onwards? And I would say, if you look at his concept of what is required for the office of the papacy to be legitimate, and we compare that with the historical evidence where the Fifth Ecumenical Council rebukes the Bishop of Rome, citing Matthew 18 for intervening without the consent of his brothers, I would say that's a very difficult thing to defend. But again, I don't take that to mean that Orthodox people have not gone too far sometimes in rejecting the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. You look at something like St. Mark of Ephesus, who's often taken to be the most anti-Roman Catholic saint in the Orthodox calendar. St. Mark of Ephesus was willing to grant a very high view of papal prerogatives. Someone like St. Simeon of Thessaloniki was willing to do the same. So I would just say that the evidence from the New Testament and from church history, and most importantly, the evidence in dialogue with each other, does not warrant the Roman Catholic view.